underlying reason for a lot of this greater vulnerability in Africa and African regions is something called the adaptation deficit. This is something that's defined by researchers and practitioners as the gap between what one would expect from good practice in adaptation to reduce impacts compared to the actual state of affairs. So, for example, if one looks at crop yields on a typical small African farm, the yields are much lower than one might expect for the environmental conditions that actually occur there. So in good years, these farmers can grow less than they should be able to and have lower surpluses, which to see them through the bad years. And in bad years, they hit harder than they should be. And then it takes more time to make up for those bad years in the good years. So we'll dig into the reasons for this greater vulnerability, this bigger sort of deficit, if you like, when we look at agriculture in one of the other weeks of the course. But the fundamental underlying reason for this greater impact of climate change is the adaptation deficit. The inputs to the farm, the ways that people farm are not as well adapted to climate as they could be, and therefore the resultant impacts of climatic events are greater than they should be. So we'll see throughout the course that this idea of an adaptation deficit is a pervasive issue across much of sub-Saharan Africa. So whether we're looking at cities or at agriculture or at ecosystems or at water, there is an adaptation deficit that has to be overcome just to build resilience to current climate risks. And this adaptation deficit is really strongly correlated with broader development challenges. Many people argue that there isn't really an adaptation deficit, just a development deficit. The fact that most African societies are not as well progressed along the development pathway as they could be, both economically, in terms of governance, in terms of education, and the whole range of factors that lead to high levels of human development, means that propagates through into creating an adaptation deficit. And so they would argue that solving development problems will actually help to solve the adaptation deficit, and that we should really be operating at that more fundamental level to overcome the development challenges, and then climate change adaptation will almost happen as part of that process. That does point to a fundamental challenge when one's thinking about climate risks themselves, and that is that what should we be doing in the adaptation space if the argument is that we should really be dealing with development challenges themselves? One way to think about this is maybe to take more of a twin track approach. So we're not going to try and solve the whole development deficit, but focus on aspects that are closely linked to climate change, and that would then really address the adaptation deficit at the same time as addressing a fraction or a part of the development deficit. So use climate change as a lever to be addressing some of those broader development challenges. We might also ask how, when we're thinking about climate change adaptation, so adaptation in anticipation of future climate risks, how does the adaptation deficit link to that future adaptation challenge? And the answer is that in Africa, the adaptation deficit is intricately interlinked with the future adaptation challenge. What it means is that the deficit defines the baseline from which adaptation has to build. And let me give an example to illustrate what that means. If we think about somewhere like the Netherlands in Europe, they already have very, very good flood management and flood protection schemes that make much of the country safe from coastal flooding. And then for them, the adaptation challenge is around improving these current management processes for any expected increase in risk due to climate change. Jump across to Maputo in Mozambique. There's very little flood management in place to deal with present-day climate risks. So the adaptation challenge is both overcoming that adaptation deficit, the lack of capacity to have measures in place to deal with today's flood risks, and then adding on to that adaptations that improve and increase resilience to the expected changes in flood risk that will happen in the future. So Adaptation Africa is as much about reducing the adaptation deficit and essentially moving up the baseline from which we have to then think about additional adaptations that might be expected in the future climate. It's a twin-track, coupled approach that one needs to be adopting.